Welcome. It's great to have you be here and be back. Um, my name is Victor Bradley. I'm so glad to have the panelists here tonight. I know all of them really, really well, and I've been looking forward to this night so much. We are the Bright Family Engagement Team, and we work with families all across New England area to facilitate peer-to-peer support groups, providing resources, help, and school clinicians and engaging families with their work. BRIGHT stands for Bridge for Resilient Youth in Transition and is an organization out of Brookline Center of Mental Health in Brookline, Massachusetts. BRIGHT helps schools build and maintain high-quality Tier 3 general educational support programs for students struggling with mental health and medical issues. There are over 150 BRIGHT programs in elementary and middle schools and high schools in Massachusetts and several other programs in New York City, or New York, the state of New York, New Hampshire, Oregon, and also in Chicago and many, many other counties. Lastly, if you have any interest in joining our mailing list to hear about groups or upcoming events, please put your email in the chat. We'll also give you that information at the end as well. Like I said, I'm very excited about these panelists this evening, and now I'm going to turn it over to Lakeisha.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Tonight, I want to introduce our three speakers for tonight. And we're going to start with Miss Denise Galford Keppel. Denise has many years of experience supporting families of young children and children with special needs. Denise holds degrees from Wellesley and Wheelock Colleges, Bay Path University, and a postmaster's certificate in early education research policy and practice from UMass Boston. A special educator, certified early intervention practitioner, coach, licensed mental health, and registered play therapist. Denise supports children, parents, and educators through approaches of the Hannon program, the pyramid model, and the developmental individual differences relationship-based model with a specialization with working with young children, those under the age of 8. Denise also raised 3 children, including a son with learning disabilities and mental health challenges. Denise, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. I'm really glad to be here. And I know that we want to get to every speaker, so I'll just say a little bit and then we'll kind of toss it around. I'll toss it back to you, Lakeisha. I think it's really important to understand that a lot has changed in past years around our understanding of learning differences, and particularly around autism. When I first began working in the early childhood world and working with young kids with special needs back last century in the 90s, it was still a low incidence condition. And so we weren't seeing very many children. It might be 1 in 1,000. And if we thought a child might have significant developmental delays, we didn't really have a lot of testing, evaluation, or treatments. Fast forward to today, and a lot of things are different. Pre-pandemic, we've had a lot of great early screening. We have first signs. The Center for Disease Control has some great milestone tools that we can use to checklist and understand how kids are doing. As well as we have a lot more understanding of major ways of supporting kids, including both ABA, special education, and then relationship-based models, and one of those being the ones that I use, DIR floor time. And I believe one of our other speakers is also familiar with that as well. Do you guys want me to go forward and kind of talk about pathways of identifying a kid who might be on the spectrum? Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about kind of like different things that I do with families. So currently, I provide play therapy to children of all disabilities and abilities. And that might work on socialization. It might work on kind of fears and worry sorts of things. There's many reasons that kids might come to me. I also work a lot with siblings. When there's a child, I particularly have a couple of twins where one of the children is fairly typically neurotypical developing and the other child has some significant issues, and helping them to understand one another and find ways to play. I do family play therapy where I work with the whole family system and help them to sort out the ways that everyone can feel good and have success. I do training and consultation. So I teach parents how to do the things that I know how to do, because parents have routines every day. You've got brushing teeth, you've got putting on shoes and going to the park, and those are all great times to support our youngsters. I also do trainings like this and consult to schools and other providers to help them kind of find the ways that we can best support kids and families. I think a common pathway where people find out about the need for an evaluation is when somebody who knows something about typical child development sort of says, I wonder, is this child developing as I would expect, or is something different? I actually did an intake with a family today who sought out to do some floor time with me. Their child is 5 and was diagnosed at age 4. And the mother told me over and over again that, well, he had the 2 words together at 2, but he wasn't talking enough. Like, he really couldn't communicate. And the pediatrician said, oh, we'll wait and see, right? So this mom had an inkling. She knew that something didn't seem qualitatively right. And then she had some early intervention services, and similarly, like, oh, he's a little bit behind in articulation, but technically, he's checking off all the boxes. And it wasn't until more recently when the child went to childcare after the pandemic and really could not sustain all the sensory information, all of the peer interactions that are required of a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old. And that was when the family sort of pushed back and said, hey, we need some real assessments here. And they were able to see a developmental pediatrician. And that person kind of sent them along their way. I think all kids should be screened. I'm a proponent of intervention. I'd rather find these kids or find out it's not that, and then kind of go back to like, hey, this kiddo is okay. So we actually want to over refer. So if you're not sure about how a kid's playing or doing, or if they're having lots of meltdowns, that's often the kids I see is where they're just having such a difficult time with transitions. Then those kiddos, we want to kind of look more carefully with a mental health counselor, a psychologist. There's so many different avenues to get evaluations, and so many people who can kind of point you in the right direction of what to do next. And I'll pause right there.
Thank you, Denise. That was great information. I appreciate that. So the second panelist that we have is Ari. Ari is a university professor in the greater Boston area. He lives with his amazing wife, and he has 3 kiddos with varying degrees of spiciness. Welcome, Ari, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here. And I've known Victor for many, many years. And as I'll be mentioning, Victor has been a very important part of my family's journey with understanding autism. And it's wonderful to meet Denise and Sarah and Lakeisha here. And so, the first thing I just want to say is I'm going to be sharing my experiences, but autism is heterogeneous. As people will say that you meet one person with autism, then you meet one person with autism. I mean, people will be different in every possible regard. And so I'm only able to speak from my perspective. I hope, some of my experiences are, can be useful in some ways. And I'd love to have any questions that anybody might have if you're sort of starting out on the process of taking care of your kiddo. And so my oldest kiddo, so my kids right now are 4, 8, and 11. And our oldest kiddo was the first one who was the one who ultimately was diagnosed with autism. And just in terms of our experiences, I think it was the process was something that took a while for us to understand. I think, Denise was mentioning that things have changed over time. And I would say that's very true, even within the scope of the 11 years that I've been a parent. I think was not a lot of discussion or people forthright, coming out and talking about autism as possibilities, from pediatricians and so on. And I think I think it's different now. I think there's probably still ways to go. I really like the idea of perhaps some universal screening, but our experiences was our oldest was, I would say, challenging from the beginning, in ways that seem very, very much like you might expect from a hard child. When they were a newborn, they would, at the end of the day, they would have a witching hour, when it would be 6 p.m. and they would just start screaming. And we sort of thought, okay, well, it's, we read in a book, okay, it's just the young nervous system getting off stress. Well, it turns out that was the case, but other things were, they never actually crawled. They they did this really cool scoot where they were on their butt and they would scoot. And what we found out was this ultimately later, this is a bunch of these things were all probably related to some sensory issues that they have. And I just want to say that that's one thing that I've learned and that we learned was that I always thought about autism as sort of as a cognitive or a social issue. And it obviously can be, but it also really affects the body. And that's primarily the way that the nervous system, the body, the way that we experienced it with our oldest. They had an extremely small palate for in terms of food, and it took me the longest time to realize that not only did they not want to eat vegetables, which you would expect from a kid, but when we took them to get a donut or something, they didn't want to eat that either. And that kind of what it took me to, part of the realizing that, oh, this is something different. Like they're not just trying to eat sweet things all the time. And but so a lot of sensory things we experienced. So nervousness around slides. I'd say they were about a year behind everybody else, kind of climbing up on a slide and doing that. Really very social and really wonderful, but a lot of meltdowns. And we started first noticing this in a preschool around 3 when they were in a large classroom, and they would keep it together sometimes during school and then come home and just be awful and, just have to unwind. And we didn't know anything about auditory sensitivities and so on. And we ended up changing preschools. That's where we met Victor. Victor was our kiddos' teacher the next year when they were, I think, 5, 4 to 5. And but, and it wasn't until they were around 6 or so that we actually had them had a neuropsych and get diagnosed. And so our experience was it was really difficult to sort of sort this out because, we didn't know. I mean, we didn't know what autism was like. And when we would talk with pediatricians about, they'd ask how things are, we're like, okay, we didn't know this is our first kid and parenting is hard and they were a hard kid. But, so they'd be like, oh, okay, lots of kids have trouble sleeping, or lots of kids, are sort of quiet and watchers rather than participating, or kind of are a little nervous around social situations, when it probably would have been helpful to hear, like this is a possibility. And let's think about that. And so it took a long time. And I think that's part of what made it difficult for us. I want to, make sure to, I'll kind of end this here and have more to say later. But that one thing that I think is really important to realize is that I think for many people on the spectrum, many kids, many grownups, that people they're not experiencing things. They don't seem like they're experiencing different things than neurotypical people. Everybody can get overwhelmed with crowds, right? Everyone can get overwhelmed with loud noise. If we're tired and traveling or have the flu, lights may seem too bright. But and so the trouble is that can make you think like, oh, okay, sometimes I'm tired and it's uncomfortable, and so let's just keep, or sometimes I'm nervous, let me help you, let's just keep on keeping on, when it's actually it's the same thing, but it's a very different experience. And I think that can be something that can be challenging, and I think requires a lot of learning to really understand how it can be something similar and also a very different kind of experience at the same time, something that could be preventing you from engaging in the kinds of things that you want to be engaging in. Anyway, I want to make sure that we can keep talking with everybody. So I'll turn it back to Lakeisha, but I'm happy to describe my experiences more, at the right time.
Thank you, Ari. That was great information as well, especially coming from a parent. So, and our last and third panelist is Ms. Sarah Subak. And Sarah is a registered and licensed occupational therapist who has been practicing for over 10 years. She earned her undergraduate and graduate degrees from Tufts University. With a background in early intervention and childhood development, Sarah is passionate about working with children and families in order to help them participate in daily activities. Sarah currently works for Newton Public Schools, working with elementary and middle school students. Previously, Sarah has experience working with children and families in a variety of settings, including home, school, and clinic settings. Sarah's completed a level 1 professional certificate in the DIR FCD model through Profectum. Profectum, thank you. Through Profectum. She recently completed an OT Neurodiversity Summit through Learn, Play, and Thrive LCC. In her free time, Sarah can be found chasing her 2 young sons, walking her dog, playing softball, or spending time outside with friends and family. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for correcting me, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. You may hear 2 young boys going off to bed at some point who really want their mama. But thank you guys for having me. It's great to kind of see this network of all different angles, right? Seeing the parent perspective, seeing the professional, seeing the educational side, which is where I'm really excited to talk tonight. And bringing in, I'm an occupational therapist, and bringing in what I do. And OT looks very different in different settings, and how we can support autistic children and teenagers. So I'm going to try and share my screen just to give me a little guidance for my presentation. Everyone can see that? Great. So as Lakeisha said, this was kind of my trajectory of getting to where I am today, and really wanting to work with the child and the family. Those are my biggest things. And I think that's the biggest message I can pass forward to families going through, figuring out what's going on with their kid, and early diagnosis, or even later on in the process, is working together as a whole unit, and then really thinking about that relationship, which is where the DIR floor time model and their relationship is really important. The relationship of the therapist with the client or the student or the child is one thing, but also about the family, right? The kid doesn't come in isolation, and making sure that the match with the therapist is really important. I've kind of moved on from the early intervention, went to OT school, worked in a variety of settings, and I'm now in the school. And so the school, clinics, and home-based, early intervention are very different settings in how services are provided. So happy to answer questions about that down the road. I feel like that's a big thing, especially in the school right now. I feel like the family piece is not always there, is not always the forefront, which I'm trying to change that in the school setting, because I think the family is still important, but you don't get that face-to-face contact with them on the day-to-day. So why occupational therapy? What can we bring to families going through this process? Ari kind of led me right into this, of thinking about like the functional and what they're doing, and how they're participating and meaningfully. Yes, we all have our sensory needs, and we all have got our quirks and changes, but how do we make what we're doing meaningful? And looking at the whole person, I think, is the most important. There are some therapists who only focus on, the fine motor, only focus on the speech, or they only want the PT to working on a specific thing. But I think OTs really look at the whole person, and have an expertise in treating that and helping that, and not necessarily fixing that, but helping support them in what they're, engaging in and participating. As I said, the importance of the relationship with the child, with the family, with the parents, with the other providers, and making sure everyone is on the same page. And then really promoting the health and well-being of the child, I think, is another thing, because if they're not healthy and, you know, working for thriving, then you're not going to make any progress and you're not going to really be helping. So really making sure that that's also at the forefront. So like I said, you know, some therapists will only work on a specific thing. And I feel like a lot of OTs, especially in the school, are like, oh, OT, you know, you do handwriting or you do fine motor, like that is all you do. And that is not at all. And even in the school, I'm working on goals related to accessing the curriculum. But there's so many other things that can help access the curriculum, especially as kids get older. You know, now I'm in a middle school. So really thinking about that independence piece, I think, is huge. I'm sure Ari's seeing that too, as, you know, 11 is getting older. You know, thinking about the activities of daily living, those ADLs, those, you know, like Denise said, the toothbrushing, the getting dressed routines. How do we integrate strategies into all of these routines that everybody is doing no matter what? Work production. So in the school, you know, is that writing? Is that typing? Is that just verbally giving a response to something? How are they producing stuff? Or, you know, something to show that they know, or completing an assignment. Self-regulation. So, you know, that's where the sensory kind of goes in. And so it's not just the sensory needs, but how are they staying regulated in order to then do something? So back to that meaningful engagement piece, executive functioning, health and safety, classroom performance, and then transitions and routines that everybody else spoke about as well. Like those are those big things that are tied into the school day, but then also throughout your home life as well. So this, you know, we do work on fine motor and the sensory processing and the visual motor integration. Ocular motor is an area of new interest for me, and really thinking about how that ties in. But none of this is in isolation. Back to the whole person. How is that whole person functioning? Like, yes, maybe there is a ocular motorist thing going on, but what is, you know, how is that impacting them? How is that showing up in the classroom or when they're playing soccer or practicing an instrument? So I just wanted to touch up back to some of these therapeutic strategies. These are kind of big picture things. I didn't really want to get into too much nitty gritty tonight, because so much of having an autism diagnosis is the individuality of it, and that no two kids are the same. So no two approaches can kind of, you know, fit everybody. But back to the importance of the relationship and finding that fit for your family. Using identity affirming language. So I think Denise and Ari also mentioned, you know, the shift from years ago and how we're working with students or children with autism. Sorry, I'm used to saying students all day long. Children with autism, and really the neurodiversity movement is really working with autistic individuals in order to see what they've learned throughout this process, and they found that using identity affirming language, so saying autistic student or child instead of child with autism, making that shift, you know, is tricky for some. There's such a medical model in our society of labeling things, labeling diagnoses, and shifting, you know, making sure the person is there, and presuming competence, you know, not just like, oh, you have this diagnosis, I assume this, but presuming that they've got the competence to do whatever activity it is really important. And then the community and kind of collaborating with the others around. I'm going to kind of stop there, but happy to add on more as we go.
I actually just want to jump in and say that I have the biggest place in my heart for occupational therapists and speech language pathologists and family therapists, and these are the people who helped us. And you know, occupational therapists were able to identify, understand like our child's sensory processing needs when that was not something that our pediatrician knew anything about. And also just work, you know, the speech language pathologist working on social thinking kinds of things, and so and regulation, all the big everything about self-regulation has been just, this was exactly all of the approach that you have just heard. Is exactly what was the most important parts for us to have, really.
And that it's not all in isolation, right? Like you're not just working on, even though I'm working on the OT and maybe more of the sensory, but like I'm integrating the language or the social into that as well. I think it's really important.
I love that you both shared about kind of the neurodiversity piece, and even thinking of social thinking, right? So that's kind of a curriculum that helps kids who might have a little bit of difficulty sort of cracking the code of friendships or understanding kind of the unstated rules. And how terrific is that? Because it's a message of all kids learn, but some kids learn differently. And when we deliver the curriculum of social thinking, how do you think socially, those kids can do the same kinds of things as any other student can.
Yeah, and I think a really important thing there is just also realizing, what we're doing when we have a curriculum about social cognition and so on is an explicit. We're teaching it explicitly, which is where, as opposed to implicit, right? When you mentioned, Denise, hidden rules, that's exactly right. Our world is filled with hidden rules. I always noticed as a kid, I was like, how are we supposed to know that you can take the food from a restaurant, but not the forks? It's like, you just learn that, right? But what I wanted to say about this is that I think, when I was growing up, for sure, things like executive functioning, self-regulations, social emotional cognition was assumed to be implicit. We just assumed that all kids will learn it from being in the world, and many do, but many don't, and that's where the explicit curriculum comes in. And I just want to say that, just to position it, because this is what we do with all sorts of things. Like, it might seem weird to talk about thought bubbles or social feelings and are you in a green zone, blue zone, if you're not familiar with this, but we do this for all sorts of things. So for kids who are dyslexic, a lot of kids will be given explicit instruction and then just sort of pick up from it. But kids who have reading difficulties will have to have more explicit instruction in it, and this sort of is the same thing for those of us who, like me, who are, putting on the pounds in my my 40s. I used to implicitly think about my food, and now I have to explicitly think about it. So it's really not anything, it may seem foreign at first, but it's really not anything different than what we have in other domains.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree also, Ari, with the food part, but I also agree with what you said around having therapists and people, OT people and therapists support you. In the classroom as a teacher, they really saved my life with children where I sort of had my tool belt had run out and I really needed extra help, extra support. I remember being really excited about when we figured out pretzels worked for your child for a snack, and they could eat pretzels because that worked for their mouth, So
Yes.
those moments I have in my brain, and just figuring out things with Sarah and with Denise, with other children, and just really thinking about them, and learning about social pragmatics, and I bow to both of you because I learned so much and felt so supported, and really could help children that I sort of couldn't reach at certain points.
Mm-hmm. I thought that was what Sarah, what you had in one of your bullet points about finding a community. I think that is so important. You have to find people who are, organizations like after school, whoever it is that have experience with it. I think one thing that we encountered was that we're at like our first preschool said that they had, that they knew how to help kids who were having challenges and so on, and they actually really didn't. They thought that they did. They had done a little professional development around it, but it wasn't something that they knew how to do. And we also, in terms of a Hebrew school that we had originally gone to, they felt that they were able to do it, and they didn't know. So I don't think it was intentionally misleading us, but they actually didn't know. So I think it's really important to find the people who really do this, and that's exactly, they know all the tricks, like you're saying, Victor, with different types of food, different types of strategies, all these sorts of things. Really important.
Well, I'm just going to jump in and you guys are doing great, by the way. Thank you. I'm learning so much. My name's Julie, and I'm wondering and I've been in education for about 29 years. And so I feel like there's been this huge shift in how we do things. And I just want to say I bow down to OTs and therapists. I use an OT. I'm a coordinator for a Bright program in Oregon, and every student gets to see the OT because I learned so much from them. And I think we all need OTs. I'm just going to say that right now, and therapists for sure. Anyway, my question for you guys is, what do you think? And I maybe start with you, Ari, and then I'll just kind of, Sarah and then Denise. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions people have about people that are on the autism spectrum?
That's a really important question. So I think, actually, I'm going to go back to another bullet point that Sarah had up about presuming competence. I think because of, again, I can only speak, I think, about children, but I think when you see a child who is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, the default is to say that they're just, misbehaving, that they're, not interested in doing what it is. They're trying to act out, they're mad at you or something like that. And obviously that is a part of everyone's life in some ways, but I think, what very clearly this was not the situation with our kiddo. And like, I just remember one time when this was the Hebrew school that we had sent our kid to, and they were going into the sanctuary to do some learning as a whole group, and they ended up hiding under one of the chairs in the pews. And I received an email from the director saying, explaining that this happened, and could I please have a conversation with my child about the, expectations for classroom behavior and all this kind of stuff. And I wrote back pages saying, my kiddo knows what to do. They know how to behave in a classroom. They know what the expectations are. They want to. When they're not, it's because they can't. They are dysregulated in some way, either because it's something sensory, they're overstimulated, they are experiencing some anxiety of something, or there might be whatever it is. And so it's really because the opposite of competence, or not the opposite, but the flip side of competence, is performance. It's your ability to implement what you know. So my kiddo knew what to do, they just couldn't do that when they needed to. I mean, and it's amazing now, more and more they can, thank God. And but I think that is, at least at a child level, I think a huge misconception that it's very easy to mistake it for being misbehavior when it's just inability.
I feel like so often I'm jumping in, that you hear people saying, that they're having a hard, or that they're giving me a hard time, especially in a school, like, oh, this child is giving me a hard time, but really it's about them having a hard time in order to do something. And whether it's the sensory, is it the lighting, is it the noise in the room, is it something that's setting them off, and really digging deeper versus like, oh, this kid is out to get me, which is not usually the case.
That actually leads to one of our questions that we had for you. And I'm Sue Donofrio. I'm one of the Bright Family Engagement Coordinators. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I feel like this is so informative. And, I think just having each of your perspectives is so helpful. This question is really about, to lead in with that point, Sarah. So what do you think kids with ASD want teachers, parents, and friends to know? What are some things that might not be evident that they might have a hard time communicating, but that's important to know? That question can be for anyone.
I can jump in, and it kind of has to do a little bit with, I would say, a myth as well. That I think that there's a myth that kids who are on the autism spectrum or have social pragmatic difficulties don't want to have friends and can't have emotional connections and can't be close in their relationships. And I think that comes from a lot of different places with some of the old information about the autism diagnosis, and it was caused by refrigerator, I'll call them parents, which is not true. But I think it's really important to know that some of these kids are very aware of their difference, and some of these kids long so much to have closeness and to have friendships. I work with a little girl who's now about 9 years of age. And when I first met her, she was fairly low functioning in that she wasn't very verbal, didn't really have a good long attention span and so forth. At this point, she's doing great. And she can say things like, well, I have one close friend, but I wish I had more close friends. And she can say that, oh, yeah, sometimes people will say when I do that, it's weird. And she actually has some depression that's related to these feelings about being different. And some people would say, oh no, a person like that can't understand themselves, when actually I think she has more deep understanding about relationships than probably your average 8-9-year-old does. So I think it's important for us to know that these kids want to connect. This mother I met today, one of her goals is that my kid loves other kids, but just has no clue how to do it. And kind of like will run up and say, hi, 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 and doesn't have the next steps. But this kid is passionate about being with others and is very social. So knowing that they really want it, and that's the reason for us to facilitate it when we can.
I was thinking something else that I'm sure everybody wants us to know is that they're all different, back to the individuality, right? Like just because this strategy worked for some kid or even worked for that same child yesterday, it might not work again. So kind of getting that toolbox. I work a lot with the teachers and coming up with a toolbox of sensory strategies or just things in your back pocket, like let's try this, or something to get the child out, if they're really having a hard time, what's that one thing that is always going to work, and then have those other things that you could try. And in the flip side, a lot of these teachers then have these toolboxes and they're like, oh, well, this kid used a weighted lap blanket, this is going to work for Johnny. And it's like, well, that might not work. That might be actually make things worse. So really getting to know the child and all of their ins and outs, and using the resources and the support systems around them to really learn them. I guess my advice to teachers is really getting to know the individuals.
Mm-hmm. I would just piggyback on I think both of these comments, in the sense that I think one thing that also can be hidden that I think probably people would want other people to know is that they're working really, really hard. That if like my child comes home and they, when they were having a lot of difficulty and they came home and they actually had a fine day, that wasn't just because it was a normal day. That was because they had to work to keep, anxiety down or whatever it was, and or to remember the explicit strategies and all these sorts of things. And so there's a lot more work. It's a lot of work for parents, but it's also a lot of work for them. And I think they want to do it. To the extent that exactly they want to have a good experience.
Well, and I think more personally, Ari, I'm wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit, and I feel like Sarah, you and Denise might have some input on this as well, so feel free to jump in. But, what came up for you emotionally when you first learned that your child is living with autism? I'm just curious about that.
Oh, this is something that affects our entire life. But it's interesting. Having the diagnosis was something my wife and I talked a lot about this. We're like, well, how is this different than what we, it didn't change what we knew in some ways. But it very much helped. I think we didn't know, we were still learning, what does it mean? I think we're still, myself personally, in terms of, like, we talk about older conceptions of autism, newer conceptions, still learning what it means, wondering what that means in terms of their future and their happiness, and what it's going to be for, is it going to be a battle with schools to get the support that they need? What is this going to, is it going to be a battle with insurance companies to pay for? We used floor time and it was amazing, but before the diagnosis, and it was not paid for by insurance, and I think, there's I'm not sure that I can be coherent about it. I think it's because it obviously you have your personal emotions with your child and your hopes and dreams for them. I think there's not so much with the diagnosis, but there was just, as my child was growing up, realizing that I couldn't do some of the things that I had imagined that I would be doing as a parent, and I think that's really important. I'll kind of end here because I have a million emotions about it. I'm positive and, and hard, but realizing that, you need to be the parent that your kid needs you to be. So if you have views of how, from what you want to do or what parenting should be like, you need to be, if they can't be flexible, you have to be flexible. And this, just one little thing about this was, we had a string of awful birthday parties because what did we do? We had a normal birthday party. We invited a lot of kids over, had balloons that accidentally popped, whatever it was, entirely the wrong thing. And we were at our OT's office, and I was speaking with another parent, and she said, "Oh, we don't do birthdays." She's like, "Why would you do birthdays? He doesn't enjoy doing birthdays," meaning they're, her son. "We don't do birthdays. We do something else, and we are able to do birthday parties, but we, have, let's say, 2 friends over or something like that." And it's just realizing, so I think, sorry, that was not specific about the diagnosis, but I think that's kind of like a big internal conversation to have is realizing that, you need to be who your kid needs you to be.
I'm just going to say word again. That's a bumper sticker. If we're gonna put that on bumper stickers, because that is the answer for everyone, right? Like, we all need to be the parent. But that's amazing that you're saying that. I just really appreciate that. That's a pearl right there. Thank you. Sarah and Denise, did you want to share anything about that, thoughts or things that you've observed?
I guess one thing I would say is I think there's a lot of what folks are calling noise, meaning kind of like, oh, there's this thing that's the right thing to do if your child is like that. And sort of what Sarah was saying, kind of about one strategy might not work the same for a different student. And Ari, I really appreciate what you shared about kind of living and learning through the process. But there's a lot of different things that are happening. I mean, we are actually living in a world where there's a lot of anxiety. So I think there are some families who are worried that there's something wrong with their kid who maybe don't need to be. We've got our kids who are really worried. Schools are places to be worried about, right? So there's a lot of anxiety. And as I trained as a mental health clinician, part of what my training is to help people to think about that and to change that. But just to really realize that our kids are afraid, and our kids with autism are also afraid that they don't necessarily like going to school if kids are treating them a certain way. The family I talked to today, I keep thinking of them because it was just today in my mind where 2 other children had kind of squished this little boy and made him feel very uncomfortable. And he didn't want to go to school again because these kids were kind of like sort of bullying, like semi-bullying, like the way that they played with this child felt unsafe to that kiddo. And just thinking about how there's so much fear that we all have, and just really holding ourselves through that. We all went through the pandemic, which has created, a world of fear and uncertainty. And I'm seeing a lot of kids who didn't get evaluated and didn't get diagnosed because of the pandemic. And I'm seeing kids who probably could have looked better if they hadn't had virtual school or if they had been in person with their classmates. So that's some of the noise that's going on, but just realizing you can't know everything. What you have to do is ask people and just kind of like, sort through what's right for you. Like that family did, like, hey, birthday parties, who needs those? We're going to do our family. Our family does it this way.
And I think, especially with the pandemic and kind of things changing, that, when I worked in early interventions, there was so much that like, oh, there's the early diagnosis or getting to services early, but I'm seeing more and more later diagnoses, right? They're now realizing things the first time they go to kindergarten. I'm doing a middle school initial eval, which like we don't often do for a kid just coming up with some things, but how important it is no matter what stage of the process you are or what age your child is, getting the help you need, at that moment is really important.
Could you each talk a little bit about that? So what might that look like for families who are just getting a diagnosis that their child might be on the spectrum? What should they do? What should they ask for? How would that look?
Do you want to go first, Sarah?
Sure. I think early on, I think in the early intervention, the younger stages, the pediatrician, you are seeing them more. So often they're the front line person, getting the early intervention referral, getting the services in place. And as they get older, the school is often the one to do an evaluation, right? You'll have an outside team, but then you'll have the school team. So kind of figuring that out and how that is different, like I said before, the different models, what the school can and cannot do. There's a lot of legality around it, which is really tough, but then it's also so powerful. These providers are with your child many, many hours of the day. But I think kind of seeking out that community, as we talked about earlier, and seeing recommendations of clinics or therapists or, like sometimes I've known a lot of doctors who will be like, okay, you need ABA, you need OT, you need PT, you need speech, you need this. And it's like, well, we can start with that, but then we need to figure out what is actually going to help your student. Like there are some kids that they don't need OT, or they don't need OT in the school that's only working on fine motor. They might, need it to address or to consult on the team about something else. So really thinking back to the individual child, but I think really using the community around you, and whether that's in person or virtually, to connect with people and get recommendations, I think is one of the biggest takeaways I can pass along.
Yeah, I would agree with all of those things. And I think really good assessment is important. So even if your pediatrician or a developmental pediatrician has diagnosed your child, your student, you want to try to get further information. So the gold standard of understanding a child's strengths and challenges is a neuropsych evaluation. Neuropsychologists are looking at your child as a whole person, their psychology, how do they feel about themselves, whether it's worry or confidence and so forth. And it's also how they are able to attack the learning. So kind of the intellectual piece of things. And so being able to find good assessments, whether they be speech therapists, OTs, that assessment is going to tell you what your kid needs to work on. And then you can kind of figure out the how piece. Families should know that kids from age 3 to 5 are eligible to get school supports. So the public school system will support your kiddo, and they have preschool programs and different individual services that happen at the public school. But that's kind of the first place you go if you've gotten a diagnosis, is to turn to the school. I always say, talk to the school psychologist, talk to one of the school adjustment counselors, because they know a lot about the life of the school and what might be ways that you can get connected. And then educate yourself about the IEP process. Kids who are 3 all the way to 22 can have an individual education program. And I'm talking about this also from my wheelhouse as well as yours, Sarah. I know that you're in the schools, but I've done a lot of things with schools over the years. And Ari, I'm sure that you've learned a lot about the process as well. But I think if you educate yourself on that, one of the big pieces is having good assessment tells you the goals tell you the services, and then the services help you figure out where the student should be. So really understanding how the IEP is kind of like foundational, and learning how you can really advocate for yourself and your kid.
That's great. I would just to tack on, hopefully the school is responsive, but there can be pushback and challenges. And, I would also just say, if you need to, you should learn about what other, appeals processes there are for IEPs and for, if they're advocates and so on. Thankfully, we have not had to do that, but we definitely know people who have, unfortunately. The only other thing I would just say, I think this is amazing, amazing suggestions. I would just say also for, on the personal side of things, I think just 2 things in terms of thinking about family dynamics can be really important. And, there's sort of undifferential load put on parents and siblings in these situations. And, we really benefited from seeing a family therapist who was really helping us to think about how to encourage independence and also have people find their positions in the family. And, just the other thing is just to, reflect on what you may need yourself. So, for example, we don't, all of my kids, as Lakeisha said, they're on varying degrees of neurospiciness. Actually, we just had a neuropsych for our youngest, and she's level 1 ASD. She just got diagnosed, even though she's, I would say, much milder than our first kiddo was. But we don't go out to restaurants because they don't eat food. so then, it's like we tried. I mean, it's not like we can get out very often, but my wife and I, it's just important for us to remember, we're never going to be able to eat at a restaurant if we ever just do that. Just assume that we'll be able to go out together with our family. So, just keep that in mind about your needs too.
I love that you shared that you used family therapy. I think more people need to say that was so helpful to us, and more people need to know that it's available. And the other thing I wanted to say, sorry, I've got dogs in the background. The other thing I wanted to say is that also, it's not generally a first route for families, but I think play therapy and working with a counselor or a mental health therapist can be really helpful for kids, because kids also need to just play. And so if they're at school all day long and they're working on friendship skills, and like you said, Ari, they're tired, they're working hard, working with a play therapist, who's someone who can use play therapy with anyone of any age, allows you to grow, kind of that whole person that Sarah was talking about earlier, feel good about yourself, kind of learn new things you might not have known. And play is the way that we kind of play about things, right? We play on, like, what about this idea? What if I'm going to be this way? What if I'm going to be that way? So just remembering play and maybe therapy is another thing for your child that could help you understand them even better.
I'll just throw out one more thing. I'm not sure that this would be the first thing I would do, but something that I only recently realized that no one talked to us about, which is think about for yourself. You know, you may yourself may be neurodivergent. I was diagnosed after our kiddo was born, but before they were diagnosed with autism, with ADHD. And so, you know, oftentimes the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree in this. And so you may know that about yourself. You may not know that about yourself. It may be something that kind of only becomes apparent when you are a parent and having kids. And so it might be something to look at. I have not received any advice from anybody saying, like, because nobody wants to suggest this to you, right? But you know, I don't know the genetic statistics, right? But there's some amount of family genetics there too. So, or to have siblings thought about also.
Ari, I want to give you an appreciation, you and your partner, for self-care. You're really, really good at finding time to spend together and taking care of yourselves. And I want you to brag about that a little bit, because you find that time, those precious moments with you and your partner to do things and go away and find things to do, just to go for walks. And that's so important.
Yeah.
Your own mental health.
Yeah, I mean, we're very privileged in terms of, you know, having a work schedule that is, you know, ends at a certain time, and we're able to do this. And but yeah, it's important. I mean, I thank you. I you know, it never feels like it's enough, but yeah, that's really important. You know, and I also just, I mean, you know, initially it was just all that I felt was just the difficulty of it, you know, early on when my child was 3, 4, 5, and it was just all, you know, day in, day out. And I think one of the most comforting things was something, Victor, you said, which was that you have maturation on your on your side. You have time on your side. You know, the kids are going to grow up. Now, obviously, you know, some things can change on their own, some things don't, and that requires a lot of work in general. But that was really comforting, and in our experience, it was true. And I think that's when you can get to the point where, like, maybe things are on average, you know, fine rather than hard. You know, you can kind of get it's a wonderful experience, and just to remember that's on the horizon.
Can I just mention something else that I'm sure Ari has also experienced, and I'll let you confirm this, but I think it's so important to have hope. You know, we kind of talk about evaluating and assessing, but I think hope is just so powerful. I've had 2 kids lately that I started working with where there was a lot to work on, and it hasn't been that long, and they've really changed and they've really connected. And so, like, having that hope that things will get brighter, you know, whether it's maturation or all different kinds of experiences. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, Ari.
Yes, I mean, it can, you know, years are slow, so it can feel like it takes a long time, but you know, that there's nothing, I would never have expected this, but I think some of the most amazing experiences have been noticing the tiny little differences. And my wife and I, our favorite kind of story about our kids was when we were, you know, like it's when the story ends and then nothing happened. Whereas, like, so for example, for a long time, my oldest would not be able to wear a backpack. They just couldn't carry it, and they would either carry it in their hand or they'd drop it or make me do it. And it was just hard. And then, you know, one time I had a story where it's like, we had to go, and you know, they put on their backpack. I said, please put on your backpack, and nothing happened, you know, because they did it. So it kind of changes into a very special kind of thing where you can appreciate, it's, you know, it's like appreciating nature. It's appreciating you know, when things are going well, you know, the little things really. So yes, absolutely. It is. And there's very good reason to hope, you know. Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That is actually how we wanted to close, and you know, we're coming to the end of our time together. But if Sarah, I know you were just about to jump in, but just to leave parents with words of hope or, some type of advice before we wrap up that might be important for them to hear? If either of you can speak to that.
I was just gonna just quickly say that, I like Victor's line about the maturation, but like also just the development, right? Like this is why I always went into pediatrics, is like you get to see the progression at whatever stage it is of child development. And every kid is so different in what they're going through, but there is, there's always something changing, which, I didn't want to work with older adults who it was the other end of the age continuum. But I think that kind of leaving with that of just, there's always something changing with the kid, changing with the relationship, changing all around, and that there's always supports to help you, whatever that thing is at that moment. Because those things will change and won't stay static.
I think it's really important for families, whether you suspect it or you're getting evaluated or you've received the diagnosis, to really just kind of go slow. Like there's this hurry up that we have. And, when we do that, then we don't take the self-care. You don't take care of yourself as the parent. And maybe you're going to want some couples therapy for you and your partner to help you figure out like, whoa, this is not what we thought was going to happen. And you want it this way, like clean your plate. And you're like, no, it doesn't matter. And now we've got this going on, right? And thinking that if you have other children or other family members, how does that impact them? I also see siblings of kids who are kind of feeling like, how come my brother or my sister gets all of this therapy and attention? What about me? So going slow and noticing kind of what everybody needs and knowing that you can't do it all. What you need to do is what you can do right now, what you can do today, what you can do tomorrow, and what you can do for this week. And there's always going to be another opportunity. There's going to be another time to brush teeth. There's going to be another time to look at backpacks or figure out what you have to do at school.
I would say, just going back to finding community. I mean, I think it is so easy to, there's so much to learn because it can affect every aspect of your kid's life and it'll impact so much of yours. And so finding mental health, people, finding OT, finding SLP people, occupational therapy, speech language pathology people who, play group people, other parents, just to compare notes. I also found it even useful to find the communities on Twitter. I mean, I don't know what's going on with Twitter at this point, but there were a lot of adults who were autistic or have ADHD or combined or a lot of other things, and would explain their experiences. And I thought that was helpful because sometimes it was hard to know, just what my kiddo was experiencing, and it's not going to necessarily be the same, but it's kind of interesting to hear it from that perspective. So I think it's very easy to sort of feel like your life is going to end and when is, especially if it's very acute, but the answer is to find the people who know and it's like Mr. Rogers, find the helpers. There's so many people who are there to do that, who want to do that.
Thank you so much. I feel like that's a perfect way to end our time together. We really appreciate you logging on and sharing your wisdom. And to your point, I think the nugget for me as a parent is, parenting the child in front of you. And then also the piece around community. I think we all, I always say like that old adage, like it takes a village to raise a child. So it's helpful for all of us to find our villages. And to that point, this is a time for me to promote our parent-to-parent support groups that meet weekly. We have several groups happening. They're open to all families of youth who are struggling with mental health issues. They're virtual. They're hosted by one of the lovely people you see here on the screen, the Bright Family Engagement Coordinators, via Zoom. And we have a BIPOC parent support group. We have a dad's group that Victor does. We have an open group for all families and a West Coast friendly time that Julie will host for us. So we hope to see you there. I'll be putting that link in our YouTube chat as well. So thank you all so much for coming. We're going to log off, and we thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Good night.